Hello and welcome. My name is Jacob W. Glazier, and I will be presenting on my topic this evening with a presentation entitled The Ethical Implications of Animism for Parapsychology. I first want to thank the Parapsychological Association for sponsoring this symposium. I especially want to acknowledge Annalisa Ventola for the hard work and creativity she displayed in order to make this e-conference possible. And the symposium chair, Renaud Evrard, for the gracious invitation extended to me to be able to present this evening. So building on the work that we've heard thus far, the work of Renaud Evrard and his development of the relationship between ecology and parapsychology, Jack Hunter, who took us through a tour of the deep ecology movement and our understanding of our place in the world with regards to this more mystical, spiritual, and ecological tradition. Michael Nam, for helping us expand our biological paradigm and seeing how biology in a different sense can help us account for instances of psi and paranormality. David Luke, who does great work in examining how psychedelics help open up our mind and spirit to other than human entities and help us connect with these entities on a very real level. What I hope to do this evening is to take a bit of a more philosophical approach and examine the way in which we can frame in a more abstract sense how parapsychology can take seriously a more ecological view of its relationship to not only its object of study, psi or paranormality, but the world itself. And so what I hope to develop is what is called in philosophy new cosmology or ontology, and this is what I refer here to in my title as animism. And some of you might be aware of the definition of animism. Briefly, it has been used to connote that the world is imbued with spirit in some sense, and so plants, animals have certain degrees of spirit or consciousness. But this new animism that has recently been revived in the humanities and in science studies is more nuanced in terms of the way that it conceptualizes the not only the world as such, but beings in the world. And so I hope to have us take a look at that and to see the kind of consequences that that might have for parapsychology. Briefly, some biographical information about myself. I have a Ph.D. in Consciousness and Society from the University of West Georgia. I was GRA under the mentorship of Dr. Christine Simmons Moore, who holds a tenured track faculty position there, and she's a parapsychologist that does excellent work in areas like synesthesia. I currently also teach as an adjunct professor at New York University. I teach graduate master's students in their counseling program. And then here in Georgia, I teach as an adjunct professor at Life University, undergraduate students in courses like health psychology, abnormal psychology, introduction to psychology, and social psychology. With specific regard to parapsychology, my main interests really include ecology and the paranormal, animism, paranthropology, the philosophy of parapsychology, so understanding the kind of assumptions or a priori commitments that this discipline as a science has committed itself to, psychoanalysis and parapsychology, excavating tools from psychoanalysis to help us look at the way that psychodynamics and processes between the unconscious and our more awake state, or the ego, how they kind of play into these instances of psi. And then finally, I have done some work building on George Hansen's theory of the trickster, and how psi, by its very nature, seems to possess some of these very wily and elusive qualities. You can find more information about me on the Parapsychological Association website that I have listed here. You can also see my CV and other research work that I've done on my academia website, which you can find at jacobglazier.academia.edu. Since tonight is a video presentation, I encourage everybody watching to send me questions or inquiries using my personal email address here. It's jacob.wglazier@gmail.com, and I will gladly and happily respond to your questions and your interests in due time. I want to begin tonight with a question, and that question is, how do researchers understand our current historical epoch? And what I mean by this is that given the kind of grand narrative that scientists, anthropologists, historians have developed or advanced, the way that the Earth timeline, certain creatures have been more prevalent than others, certain Earth changes have occurred, like the Ice Age. How do we understand our current historical epoch? And what do researchers and theorists have to say about this current historical predicament? They have a name for this, and it's called the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene, you can see this first bullet point offers us a pretty good definition in that it is our current geological time period that's dominated by human influence. And what I mean by that is that through the use of technology, gadgets, tools, humans have been able to engineer and terraform the planet in ways that in a certain sense have kind of outpaced their ability to control it. And as a result, we have situations around the planet, such as the extinction of species, fires, the Australian fires last spring, and other kinds of earth catastrophes that are the result of this kind of dominated time period, dominated by the human. And as you can see, this, I really believe, is the most pressing ethical dilemma of our time. And Donna Haraway, who's a well-known feminist researcher in science studies, she states here that the Anthropocene marks severe discontinuities. What comes after will not be like what comes before. And she thinks it's our job to make the Anthropocene as short, thin as possible. Part of the reason for trying to get past the Anthropocene, as the very term denotes, is that it places the anthropos, or the human, the man, at the center of these earth changes. And a lot of scholars in ecology, even aesthetics, science studies, technology studies, gender studies, see that this is inaccurate, in fact. That I think the Anthropocene ascribes too much power to the anthropos, and the strategy for getting past this notion of human-centeredness, I think, helps us open up a new relation to beings that isn't marked by this human exceptionalism. And so part of the work that we have to do as parapsychologists and as scientists is we need to work to decenter the human. And not only that, doing this work in our laboratory, in our thinking, in our conceptualization about psi, but seeing how this kind of privileging of the human being, how it gets, in some ways, gets in the way of our ability to study psi. And so what we'll see, hopefully, as I move forward, is how we can unfold that into what we can call an ethics of parapsychology. Parapsychology, not just parapsychology, but science in general, takes many of its ideals from Enlightenment thought. And the Enlightenment occurred roughly through the 1600s to the 1700s. And these ideals have helped foster this deleterious state of affairs of the planet. And so some of these ideals that still kind of sneak into our practice as parapsychologists include a sort of reductionist science, to be sure, a materialist reductionist science. On a more social or cultural level, we can see these phenomena such as globalization, capitalism, technological progression. All of these are in some ways remnants of this Enlightenment way of understanding and framing the world. And as I say here, the third bullet point is that parapsychology has inherited many of these ideals. And through or vis-a-vis its research methods, its assumptions about science, what is science, why do we want to be a science as parapsychology, what does the very term science mean, why are we trying to be a science, is there another way we can reconfigure science to better fit what the paranormal seems to be telling us about the world? And it's, of course, its commitment to specific ontologies or cosmologies, right? And predominantly, I think it's fair to say that parapsychology has favored what in the literature is known as physicalism, or kind of reductionist materialism, whereby we can reduce our kind of study of psi. It will be explainable through certain explanatory models that we may take from physics, such as quantum theory, right? However, I want to challenge that. I want to challenge that way of using tropes from physics as a way to understand and engage with the paranormal. I think it does psi a disservice in many ways, and I think that's why we see this trickster phenomenon happen in the laboratory. The J.E. Kennedy, as well as George Hansen, have pointed out that when we apply these technological means through experimentation to try and isolate variables or try and isolate occurrences of psi, it doesn't work a lot of times. And of course, when it does work, not only is parapsychology attacked by more skeptical scientists in mainstream disciplines, but the research isn't accepted in the same sense that research is accepted in psychology. And so I think we, as parapsychologists, need to ask ourselves, why fight that fight? Why try and become mainstream when there's alternative approaches that may be more transdisciplinary in nature? And for example, allying parapsychology with psychoanalysis, or even looking at literary studies as a way to look at the way that metaphors figure into our understanding of the paranormal. And of course, Jack Hunter does fabulous work in paranthropology. pairing anthropology or anthropological methods with the study of paranormality. So again, to reiterate what I was saying a bit ago, this traditional reliance on physicalism and experimentation in parapsychology are antecedents of this human exceptionalism. So why do we want to place the human in this privileged position when we know that, as Michel Foucault has told us several times, that these very traditions of physicalism, what we could call scientism, they're not only historically contingent, but they're culturally arbitrated. And so another way to put that is that physicalism and experimentalism produce their own forms of truth, and this mirrors the larger apparatus that we could say pervades legendary science. We need to, I think, question whether or not we want to be a part of this specific paradigm. To pose it as a series of questions, you can see here, why is parapsychology still trying to replicate the techniques and methodologies of physicalism and experimentation? Cardinia had a wonderful review article published recently in a very flagship journal, The American Psychologist, where he looked at the evidence for psi, and this is a great benefit to parapsychology that this occurred. Yet you have skeptics like Raber and Alcock who continually challenge these well-supported, rigorous, statistically significant results. So I'm wondering, why engage in the polemic in the first place? Why not shift the parameters of the entire debate to not at the level of method, to the level of what is science itself? And have we been actually doing the kind of science that we need to do? And one way we can do that is to self-reflect. Do parapsychologists want the prestige of becoming scientists? Okay. Of course, we want funding for our discipline. Are we trying to seek some kind of institutional funding? Are we trying to disseminate the discipline? All right, and so I think my point is that I think that we need to ask ourselves, what is it that we're trying to establish? Is it the reality of psi, or is it something perhaps more subconscious that motivates our desire? So what I'm calling for is a new animism, and this new animism rehabilitates what European colonizers and anthropologists going out into the world, they would encounter certain tribal traditions, certain cultures, and many of these indigenous societies had a belief about the world that it was imbued with spirit, that they could commune with ancestral spirits, with other than human beings in the spirit world, in a different kind of dimension we might use in today's metaphors. But it was often a pejorative or a negative word that these European colonists would use. And so in a spirit of reclaiming the word animism, this is what we might refer to as a neo-animism, or a new animism, a new way to look at how we can understand the complex web and interconnection that all beings seem to possess on the planet. And you see here Donna Haraway, who I've mentioned previously, Bruno Latour, who is a very well-published and respected philosopher on science and cosmopolitanism and other topics, has espoused this worldview as well. Isabella Stangers has devoted 2 massive tomes to this, to unpacking this Neoanimism. She does great work in science studies, gender and sexuality studies, and so these scholars with others, right, have helped to revitalize this kind of cosmology, this kind of animism. And so it gets us away from physicalism. And on principle, such a conception admits all sorts of beings into its fold that were necessarily excluded by more materialist models. And these beings include things like spirits, non-terrestrials. I'm thinking of anthropological examples, pixies, gnomes, elves, and the list could go on and on. And animism offers a somewhat paradoxical approach, however, because in this sense it's more generous with regards to its worldview or its understanding of the world. Yet it's more violent in that it decenters the human. It undercuts this kind of human scientism that has plagued us, perhaps beginning with the positivists in the early 1900s, and that we really haven't been able to shake the remnants of that from our understanding of science. Not only that, if we want to develop a Foucauldian critique, we could see that this has found our way into the fabric of our social institutions, and that it's really going to take a kind of revolution, I think, to get us out of this pernicious bedfellowship that has occurred between Enlightenment ideals and notions of truth in science, and the way that we understand economies, and the way that we understand even the media on a larger scale. With regards to parapsychology, what I'm advocating is for more of a pluralist approach to methodology. And of course, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the quantitative versus qualitative distinction in research methods. The quantitative is going to include experimentalism, blind, single-blind, double-blind studies, quasi-experiments, correlational studies, and is going to rely heavily on statistics and certain mathematical formulas, whereas qualitative methods is going to look at more anecdotal or even observational data that we can then apply certain methods to. We don't need numbers, in other words, to ascertain certain truth claims. You see here, John Kruth has articulated this kind of turn toward more qualitative approaches in parapsychology. And not only that, we see again a rise, as Caswell, Hunter, and Tesaro pointed out, rise of more anthropological and ethnographic methodologies that are just, if not more effective than the traditional scientific approach. And I've listed here some specific qualitative approaches. I've used and have been published in the journal Mortality using the descriptive phenomenological method. You also have the interpretive phenomenological method, discourse analysis, grounded theory, ethnography, autoethnography, narrative analysis, case studies, and so on and so forth. And so, of course, I think mixed methods approach is also really helpful in kind of helping shift the paradigm. But I think the point is that the kind of old guard in parapsychology has, for some reason, interesting reason, been obsessed or fixated on this experimentalism, or trying to establish itself as a science, or be reputable as a discipline, be taken seriously by mainstream psychology. Not that that's bad, but I'm curious about that desire, and I'm curious why there seems to be reluctance in maybe the later generation of parapsychologists to adopt models that come out of the humanities as opposed to the hard scientists. It's so I think there's more to be said about that. So what might this new animism say about ethics in psi? And so I've tried to walk us through the kind of implications on the level of method, on the level of cosmology. But if we want to, as the title of the talk insinuated, if we want to examine ethics and how this new animism establishes a different ethical relation for us as parapsychologists, what is this going to look like? So a working definition of ethics that we could use might be something like a set of moral principles that govern a form of praxis. Of course, the very definition of ethics is up for dispute, as moral philosophers will tell us. But I think for our purposes, I think this is a good way to understand what we mean when we say a new animism, and what this new animism brings to bear on our understanding of ethics. So as I've alluded to, Western institutions like the academy, science, economics, we need radical reconceptualization and material revamping. And in order to do that, I think parapsychologists, because psi is so fringe, and because I think there's a subversive quality to the paranormal, such that it undermines current values about the world, that psychologists, that mainstream scientists implicitly have. And I wonder how we can capitalize on that subversiveness and the power that psi has to open up people to a worldview that is foreign in a lot of ways, and can be very threatening as well. So what I want to stress, though, is that this is not a Max Weber re-enchantment of the world project. I'm not trying to argue for that. So it's not a return to indigeneity, right? Indigenous ways of being, nor to enchantment. But it's a kind of new envisioning of the world, kind of, we could say, uncovering of what has been obfuscated through the kind of Enlightenment project. The human, qua subjectivity, understood as subjectivity, as I've argued in my book, The Arts of Subjectivity, A New Animism for the Post-Media Era, is enmeshed and interlinked with innumerable different beings. And for parapsychologists, we can see this in terms of the ethical relationship that we have to research participants. And not only we can look at the way that metaphors and language figure into our co-construction of psi experiences in the laboratory. That could be one avenue to pursue. But also at a clinical level. I think as clinicians or as therapists, when clients come to us with stories of paranormality, I think it behooves us to believe them at first, as opposed to this skepticism that as researchers and scientists we've been trained to kind of implicitly have. So there's a bit of a struggle going on, and I think that the new animism that I'm proposing favors this more kind of open, embracing belief of psi, and as opposed to this kind of skepticism that we've inherited through the past several centuries. You see here my references. If anybody would like a copy of the reference list, please email me and let me know. I think just some concluding remarks. I'm really proud and hopeful to be in this field, and I think that parapsychology, as scholarship moves forward and the academy moves forward, I think we're in a really interesting place, and I wouldn't be doing work in parapsychology if I didn't believe that. And so I think we have, not to use the kind of trite Kuhnian paradigm shift phrase, but I think we're at a point where we are able to offer an alternative to what people are becoming disillusioned with, and that is a certain materialist, reductionist, physicalist science. And I think we can either capitalize on this desire, and that's what I hope we do, or we can let it pass us by. And I think that would be really unfortunate, given the phenomenal work that's done in parapsychology, and the kind of light that is being shown on a systemic and rigorous study of the paranormal and of psi, and that not only that is possible, that we can study these phenomena that other researchers refuse to study, but at the level of belief that we can actually believe in the paranormal in certain senses.